All right. This week, we had a number of interesting developments on Capitol Hill as Congress was getting ready to go home for vacation. Obviously, you had the infrastructure bill and Kirsten Sinema looking like somebody put pineapple on her pizza as her co sponsored bill gets massive bipartisan support, which is really every bipartisan senator's dream. It was very confusing, her reactions this week. But that's not what I wanted to actually talk about here. What I wanted to talk about was the DC police's testimony before Congress, not just the substance of it, which in and of itself is poignant, might I just say. However, you might feel broadly speaking about the need for massive reforms in law enforcement. The testimonials of people earnestly scared for their lives, and talking about how they've gone through like PTSD. Officer, I forget his name. It's not Malone, but like Pallone or something like that. Fatone, his when he slams the table, that was 100% authentic. Not a doubt in my mind that was coming from an authentic core of real frustration, bitterness, anger, a sense of abandonment, and a deep sense and a true sense of being wronged. Now, I'm saying all of that because in and of itself, it's poignant, but sometimes elected officials want that, right? Like sometimes, we bring forward people and we want, and by we, I mean like, the Democrats or the Republicans bring forward people. Those people are there to serve a specific narrative purpose or whatever. That was distinctly not the vibe I got from DC police because I kind of felt like they came out swinging, broadly speaking, at Congress like all of you need to lift a finger to defend us. They, of course, had absolutely no tolerance for the Republicans, most of whom refused to even be part of that bipartisan commission to investigate the crime that was done to these people. So, like, the anger and bitterness is like sort of like a given right there. But I also detected legitimate ire and frustration at the Democrats that thus far this is where we're at. In the week before y'all are going on vacation, we're coming in and we're doing this testimony. And what are you guys really going to do with this bipartisan commission? Like, what is this congressional hearing really going to amount to? And what kind of justice should I expect coming from this?
Well, yeah, the clips that I saw really, what I picked up on was, they were traumatized, and I didn't get that they felt like the Congress was going to actually do anything about it. I just sensed trauma and frustration.
Finbar, did you see any of the testimony?
I actually didn't see very much at all. I actually listened to a lot of the clips that were being played by, say, through other different, some of the different media, that podcast that I'm listening to, so I get basically delayed live stuff from the States or whatever like that. And a bit like that. I mean, there was a lot of anger in terms of like the idea that the concern that, yeah, this is just going to be a little talking shop you might use for a while. It's a little, but that actually there's nothing really will happen. And if for anything, nothing else, they'll just be used as something to beat the opposite side with, I don't know.
No, I mean the very presence of the bipartisan infrastructure deal and this like deep fetishization of bipartisanship over accountability. I mean, if you're an officer testifying about how like you thought you were going to die as you got shocked over and over and over again, meanwhile you see Kristen Sinema like hugging every Republican she can find, how positive do you feel about the Democratic Party's ability to hold any member of the Republican Party accountable for anything?
I don't think there's any. Well, I'd seen some of the pictures of some of the Republicans with the bands supporting the woman who was shot. And I think like it's just, it doesn't seem.
Meanwhile, and Marjorie Taylor Greene and others tried to go and meet with the political prisoners, aka the detained terrorists, here this week. So like again, if you're an officer, you're an officer and you're seeing that these domestic terrorists are, and you're calling them domestic terrorists, are in jail. Meanwhile, the Republicans are going and meeting with them. And meanwhile, the Democrats are still like, well, we got to find a way to work together. Where do you fit in that America? That's got to be a maddening situation.
But what I don't understand though, I suppose, in a bit, and maybe this is where we're talking about the media, that is within the States, politicians on a national stage that are so devoid from reality, not reality, but any kind of facts, and can get away with it to that extent. Not just like in Ireland, we would have a lot of censure motions for people who would say that. If anybody says anything that's untrue, they have to come back in and apologize for what they've said. They will be held up and made, and it is a crime to lie in the parliament. And if
I
you do,
cannot even imagine something like that happening in America.
We have the opposite of that, Robert. We have the speech clause. The whole thing that basically, like in Congress, you're allowed to say lots of bullshit, all with under the speech doctrine or whatever that protects like members of Congress. They're actually using that right now as a legal defense for speaking at the 1/6 rally. We found out Paul Gosar this week showed up in protective like equipment here, because it was a peaceful rally, which is why he wore a bulletproof vest. Paul, did you think you were gonna get shot by your own people, or did you think your people were gonna do shooting? Like where did you think the bullets were coming from, Paul? Antifa?
yeah, again, it's very hard to like it's very hard for us to sort of look at that from our point of view, because where we see that sort of behavior, it's so anomalous. It's something very hard to actually equate what's
Yeah,
happening in the
it's the
States
difference
with
between Boris
reality.
Johnson and Trump, right? Like it's just like
Mm.
I mean, if there was like a real attempt to overthrow Parliament by like Nigel Farage fringe right wingers or whatever, Johnson and the Tories would like no that. I don't see them then coming back around and trying to like and by no they would no that, and more importantly during the legal process brought against the domestic terrorists, Johnson and the Tories would not be lifting a finger to help out the terrorists for trying to do a 21st century Guy Fawkes impression.
Yeah, I don't know everything about Ireland, but I can't help but think that that wouldn't go down well where you are.
No. The other thing that would happen here in Ireland, particularly, is once anything happens, once the police get involved, there's no politician going to talk about it. Silence. They won't, like, because what happens in Ireland is that if a politician talks about a case, the first thing you do in the defence is say, well, the politician said I was guilty, or the politician said this. I can't get a proper trial, so you get a mistrial. So politicians are, we had a couple of very senior politicians who've talked about cases that were ongoing, and the cases fell apart, and the politicians themselves, basically were very much damaged by it. So that's a big difference here. We don't have the same kind of commentary on ongoing cases as you have there.
I mean, like as you're saying this, my mind is just racing through the last 4 years here with just Donald Trump alone and going like, oh my God, like dear, it's like the hellmouth. It's so bad.
Yeah, no, that sounds really awesome. How could we make that be a thing here at some point?
Here's what bothers me, Robert. Like that we're talking about this on the show. It's the first time I've thought about that. Very obviously should be like a law. That's like basically something that like our side is not even remotely talking about yet. So obviously should be a basic like thing that I think could very easily get 60% support for real easy with a basic campaign of like politicians can't weigh in on cases anymore. Done.
That would be so great.
And like, look, I get that it cuts both ways. I'm fine with it. On balance, it would be obviously good for politicians to stop weighing in on cases. Yeah, no. All right. So next, I've got like the weekly dose of bad news for all of us. in here. So bad news bit number one, we're in the bubble. And by in the bubble, I mean you and me, Robert, and other panelists involved with this show know and revile Joe Manchin and Christian Cinema pretty deeply. That being said, this knowledge of Joe Manchin by the broader Democratic electorate even is lacking, which, like, once again, boy, does that serve as a poignant reminder of the despair. Like, why do we lose it? I mean, like, do we forget that there are people who dutifully go and vote in the primaries and who have no idea who Joe Manchin is? And so, I mean, if that's where you're starting from, your processing of Democratic politics is absolutely different from mine or Robert's. Like, and it's almost impossible for me to get my brain around a politics without Joe Manchin, especially me.
Most people in America don't vote, and if they do, most of them will either just vote straight ticket or they'll just look at some ads 2 or 3 weeks before an election and go off of that. There's no sense of object permanence in our political discourse. I don't know what to do about that.
I don't know either. And in terms of moving Manchin, these numbers in this new AP poll are very favorable. So the headline in Newsweek tries to make this look bad, but it's bad for Manchin's reelect, but it's great for him, broadly speaking. Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia is viewed negatively by a third of Democrats because of his opposition to changing the filibuster rule, according to a new AP poll. And around 2 in 10 Democrats have a positive view of Manchin. So that leaves 5 out of 10 who have a neutral view of Joe Manchin. So they think he's aight, or they have no opinion on him at all. Not really honestly sure which is worse out of those two. But more importantly, 7 out of 10 Democrats basically think Joe Manchin is within the boundaries of acceptable, is the takeaway for me. And I mean, that, like, it's a problem for the progressive movement in the sense that the progressive movement necessarily is going to always be reliant on the pool of high information Democratic voters. Insofar as we're going to win, it is going to be marshaling all high information progressive voters in one clear, laser focused direction. And because you are going to have this 7 out of 10 who are not going to be with us. Maybe some of them can be, like the people who don't know nothing might be able to be courted. The people who blow with the wind might be okay. But those 2 out of 10 who actually think Joe Manchin is good, that's already starting in the column of the bad guys. And so like they actually start off in a not bad position, and they're the establishment. So they get to, then go in and we're talking about the cafeteria Democrats here are taking what they're serving up there. This 3 out of 10% is like our crowd. And I think it's important to just kind of keep that in context. That, like, we're about maybe 15% of the country, and we're in not great places to make a win in the primary map as presently constructed. So one thing that progressives really should be fighting for is changing the primary rules.
Oh, absolutely. Ranked choice voting would solve a lot of these
No, I'm talking
problems.
different schedule too. You need
Yeah.
New York and or California needs to happen much earlier in the race.
Yeah, and one of the big lessons of Trump is that for a lot of these people who don't show up to vote or aren't engaged in politics and don't really care, that guy wasn't enough to move the needle for them. So you look at a Cinnamon or a Manchin, and well, if Trump didn't move the needle, this guy certainly isn't going to. I mean, he's not at least on the news saying wild stuff every day, and that's apparently the bar right now.
I think what really troubles me is the ambivalence towards even getting the Democratic agenda advanced. It is that there's so many Democratic voters who are kind of like, well, I call them the cafeteria Democrats. They're taking what's getting served. No matter, like what's on the menu today doesn't matter. Fill my tray. Like, and that alarms me. If you set the bar low, you're gonna get whatever they're given.
One thing I noticed, because I don't get as much Joe Manchin as perhaps you do, but I think he's very careful with how he is seen. So a lot of people complain. You hear a lot of complaints about him, and then he occasionally seems to make, talk, and he sounds like he's very like he knows what he's talking about. And he does. He's not a dope. He's not a stupid man. And I think that is something that comes across in his favor for people who don't know very much, if you know what I mean. Like, so he maybe makes a lot of people who complain about him seem a little bit hysterical. And if a lot of your voters aren't, a lot of people on the left are voting for things for other people, so they're not as aware. You know what I mean? Like, so if you're voting for, like, I've got a job. I would vote. I vote for on the left, or I vote Green. And most of those things are going to be affecting other people who are poorer than me. So I can't gauge exactly how everything is going.
No, this is actually a great point. The biggest knocks on Manchin are things that are home runs for people of my political valence, but maybe don't have the same level of salience for someone closer to the center. So, like, if we're talking about what are the problems with Joe Manchin, the problems with Joe Manchin are that he and his daughter are heavily involved in Mylan Pharmaceutical, who made like a bajillion dollars off of the EpiPen and spiking the prices on EpiPen and pharmaceutical prices. Look, if you're a progressive or a lefty, like, that's disgusting shit. If you're a moderate, like, that matters. But like, it's like Joe Manchin's not Martin Shkreli for whatever reason. Like, you know what I mean? Maybe he should be. The next thing you might want to take a look at is that Joe Manchin's been bringing home the bacon for this coal power plant that he is making a ton of money off of. This is another one that, unless environmental priorities are high in your political like ladder of what matters, that might not necessarily be a home run. If you're like a deficit person, or like a foreign policy type, you might not care that the guy's like clearly against all of this climate change stuff because he's bringing home the bacon when it comes to this coal-fired power plant. So, like, that's the thing that I think is tricky, is that, to your point, Manchin's reveals have been very strategic. Like he's done a very good job not, let's say, going fully anti HR1 and really having himself head to head with the Congressional Black Caucus. Manchin's done just enough to sabotage HR1 without ever like being like, I hate John Lewis, something like that.
Well, and as far as getting rid of this guy, to what you were saying, and I've brought up before, is that, if you want to primary Joe Manchin, we need to learn from the Lincoln Project and learn to craft a damn attack ad. It's not like there isn't stuff to go after him with. And, Finbar, what you were saying, that's a lot of Americans. They just don't know much about him. And that's the fault of the people who want to get rid of him.
Absolutely. Look, informational campaigns are important. Attack campaigns are important. AOC really, I mean, like, to your point, what Finbar was saying, Manchin's trying to keep his hands clean. AOC could be in West Virginia and making Joe Manchin's life hell. Really kind of like, is because Republicans have such a, like, West Virginians probably broadly speaking have a negative view of AOC. And if she goes there and is herself and is personable, relatable, so much more like them than any other politician, and like slowly basically just doing a charm offensive through West Virginia, Manchin's gonna very quickly be a dude without a party. I mean, I think it is important for progressive politicians at this point to be really thinking about how do we more forcefully challenge some of these cinema and Manchin types, because it's not like, yes, it would be great if Schumer and Pelosi would stand up to Manchin and cinema. Absolutely. That's also not going to happen. Like, it'd be great if I was a unicorn and I could fly in the sky crapping rainbows. This is also not going to happen. So what could happen is Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, instead of, let's say, Elizabeth Warren going and campaigning for Gavin Newsom, who like is at best a morally gray Democrat, at absolute best a morally gray figure. Between the extracurricular activities and the offshore drilling permits and his COVID-19 response, I just don't know why any progressive would think that Gavin Newsom's worth fighting for. Um, just my 2 cents on that. Kind of like going Sanders going on the hills rising. I don't do we not know what the hills rising is at this point? Like, come on, guys, let's stop this. I do think that these people, instead of wasting their time on those various activities, need to be figuring out a way to put the screws to cinema. Like, here's the thing about cinema. Her little moderate routine is going to be cutesy wootsy until grandma and grandpa progressive come there and just like slap her millennial ass down. I mean, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, particularly Warren, when it comes to like, oh, Kristen, please explain your policies. Cinema is an absolute policy lightweight. And like, Warren would embarrass her. Like, it would absolutely intellectually pants Kristen Cinema in any sort of policy discussion of why cinema feels this or that about anything, and very quickly expose that cinema has whatever belief she has, but for no other reason than because there's a financial interest for it.
Well, yeah, and that gets right back to, so why aren't these people doing any of that? And why aren't they at least getting ready for primaries and stuff? And why are they defending Ray Davis? And why is there so much defense of, Como? I mean, they've undermined themselves to paint Trump as abhorrent, and Trumpism is abhorrent because, they can't, like, they can't get on their own side and push forward. And like you were saying, with one goal, and that would be winning somewhere.
Yeah, and it's got to be singular at this point. I mean, I think one of the big mistakes, and this was so true during the primaries, was a vast overstatement of how many progressives there actually are, and a deep, deep belief that we are much closer to 50% than we actually are. We're at a solid 35% in that Democratic primary.
Yeah, and a lot of I think people got that impression because a lot of the policies we favor are actually really popular and are becoming more popular. Medicare for all
But they're
is
not the same thing. Yeah, yeah,
but,
yeah,
but
yeah.
then but then everybody starts throwing around the socialism word, and people dive under their desks because the Ruskies are going to come
Well,
for
and
them.
it's got to be a certain person too, right? Like I'll give you a good example. Andrew Yang, right? Like Andrew Yang was in favor of a policy, the universal basic income, that I think, under various constructions, would be a policy I'd be in favor of. But Andrew Yang always had some question marks around his candidacy. And I'm talking like prior to the mayoral, look, it was a complicated presidential run. I think it was a much more clarifying mayoral race. But it matters who is executing the policy just as much as what the policy is. Like, I think the mistake so often we've been making is sort of like, well, okay, yeah, like on political paper here, Bernie Sanders is like way too old to run and like from the wrong state and doesn't have the political base or whatever, but he's in favor of such popular policies that none of that stuff's going to matter. He'll overcome all of that stuff. And I think, yes, very much the 2020 primaries for me, an important takeaway for me was that, like, no, 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 these things are always going to be interlinked. Okay, everyone went silent. The for change on the show, no one over talked and everyone over muted. All right, that's fine. It's fine. Let's move on real quickly here. Quick note on judicial reform. Things are looking sus as hell when it comes to judicial reform. So this was taken from an article in Courthouse News, which used to be Law News with the Z, which was like one of the worst names for a website ever. That was actually a halfway decent website. No, I mean seriously, like who in like the last decade names anything with a Z? Come on, come on. I'm sorry, but felt strongly about that. This is supposed to tout Hank Johnson's ridiculous proposal, but like if you're familiar with Hank Johnson, the congressman who once thought that islands could like capsize if there were too many things on the island, he's not necessarily like a thought leader inside of the Democratic Party. He's got some political clout inside the CBC, but he's not necessarily the guy who's advancing all the policy and everything like that. What is much more likely is this bill, a judiciary proposal made by the 26-member Judicial Conference of the United States in March. That's the conference. It was taken up by the Senate Democrats, which will allow for 77 new district court seats. And it was co-sponsored by a Republican Senator, Todd Young from Indiana, who you probably haven't heard of and is fairly conservative. It would only allow the president to fill 39 new seats in 2025. And then the remaining 38 seats would be filled by whoever the next president is in 2029. So Todd Young is willing to give the Democrats what they want after 2 more elections if they can win both of those. And the Democrats have taken this deal. Or this seems to be the deal that is on the table and much more likely to make its way through the Senate at this point.
It's almost like the Republicans had a plan for after Mitch McConnell appointed all those judges or something.
And, we're still waiting for that Joe Biden blue ribbon commission on how to reform the courts to come back with their findings. I'm looking forward to it. I imagine Bull Simpson level work will be coming our way.
Yeah, he's going to expand the court just any minute now. I check the news every morning when I wake up. It's any day now.
The one thing that's notable from this article that I am focusing more in on, what I think is more likely, is that Johnson and other Democrats are in favor of like vastly expanding the lower court system. So like obviously the Supreme Court expansion, let's be real here. It should happen. It will not happen. I think anyone who's kind of seriously associated with this show, especially if I ask you to pull out your wallet and put some money on it, would be pretty real that the court's going to be 9 seats for the foreseeable future here. We're just stuck in this morass. But I do think that it's much more likely than 0. But I mean, beyond that, like actually within the realm of possible that we see an expansion of the lower court system on some level, or a creation of a new circuit court system here at some point during this congressional term, if the Democrats can get their feet underneath them at some point.
Just actually a note I'm thinking about that is that if a lot of the stuff that's being pushed up to the Supreme Court, is an awful lot of it is because nothing is going through the the Senate or the problem is the Senate, so where they're not bringing in laws that are actually clarifying the situation. So it's giving the space for people to bring the cases. So whether it's Roe v. Wade that should have had law brought in the last 45 years, and other ones since then that should have been where there's not clarification that the problem is with the legislature that have basically allowed this power to get bigger and bigger. I wonder if rebalancing that is more likely than the court being expanded.
I mean, this is actually a really interesting point. One piece of analysis that I do think is worth noting of how we got to this point where Roe versus Wade kind of hangs in the balance is, yeah, along the way here, there really should have been more of an attempt legislatively to protect and strengthen Roe. However, abortion support has always been sort of weird among the legislative class, because like the idea of the Democrats being sort of uniformly in favor of abortion is sort of a commonly held perception now, especially among the younger set. But like if you go back into the 90s and like even in the aughts and stuff, there are a lot of openly anti-abortion Democrats. And if you go further back, there are pro-life Republicans like the Bushes and stuff. George W. Bush was staunchly pro-life. Barbara Bush was pro-choice. So like this used to not be a political dividing point, but at the same time, because when it was probably safer, it was because there was support on both sides of the aisle. It made it much harder to get a bipartisan piece of legislation through that supported Roe, because you had bipartisan opposition. And bipartisan opposition is beautiful for fighting a bipartisan piece of legislation.
It just, I know, back on that one point, I know I was listening to before, whereby before Roe, Republicans were much more pro-choice, and even right down to the, I think a lot of the religious, right leaders weren't particularly interested in in the topic of abortion itself, because it wasn't important to them, so to speak. But I just find it interesting that, say, in Ireland, we had a similar problematic piece of law like Roe, where basically people would chip away at it from all points, and we end up having a constitutional amendment. Or basically, we had a referendum, and we just removed the law and actually sent it to excuse me, we sent it to the Parliament and told they have to set the law, and that was the way it was. We sort of took it out of the constitution altogether.
I know you guys in Ireland, you're used to making big changes much more regularly than we are. And I'd like to hear more about that at some point, but I hear you talk about like a constitutional amendment to change something. I can't even imagine that happening here anytime soon on anything.
No, but here's what's crazy about that. If you go back to around the year 1970, that's only as far back as you really need to go. You can see several different constitutional amendments getting introduced in the passage of a constitutional amendment in the 70s. Like it's it seems impossible right now, and that is definitely a testimony to where our politics are at in America. And they're in a really bad place. And yeah, a look at world news and a look really from like a world perspective, and like countries that analogize nicely to the United States, or at least serve as useful prisms for understanding the United States, with like key differences that we can kind of parse out and analyze. Yeah, you can see very clearly like our system's broken. Like our two political parties like can't work together because one of them are domestic terrorists. I know, I'm serious. Like that's like it's not, I'm not even trying to
Well,
hit that
you're
one as
right,
like
and
a
people need
punchline.
to start saying it.
Yes, and that's the other big problem is people aren't saying it. So when I say something like that, it almost evokes laughter, because it's like it's funny to, wow, you're calling a political party domestic terrorists, but then the other part is like, oh yeah, no one ever just says that, but like that's the truth. Like it's so frustrating to watch the news. It's like, no, I mean, I just
Well,
couldn't imagine the Democrats after 9/11 going to
when you're
Guantanamo Bay and meeting with the prisoners and being like, we're going to get you out. You guys are innocent.
so much has happened that it's easy to forget. But like they've been shooting up mosques and synagogues and like trying to overturn an election by force. What else do you call this? And I'm not excusing the Sanders supporter who went to shoot up Congress by any means, but the overwhelming amount of this political violence we're seeing is the far right. And that's what terrorism is. And people are afraid to call it what it is. And that's really dangerous.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So like on this, the Bernie Sanders congressional shooter, the Sanders supporter was a congressional shooter. That was domestic terror too. Would 100% support that guy getting brought up on domestic terror charges. But here's the difference between that guy, because like one thing the Republicans like to do is conflate these two things, and that both sides do it, right? Here's the difference. That guy, the Bernie Sanders lunatic, was not operating off of any piece of doctrine from progressives or progressive outlets that actively encourage this way of thinking.
Yeah, nobody
Whereas
is greenlighting that crap.
nothing. No, Jacobin the Nation. I mean, the Atlantic, shitlib publications, whatever you want. I mean, that's not sanctioned okay stuff in any of these outlets, whichever one you have the dimmest view of, whether it's the Gray Zone or the New York Times or whatever. Like, none of them are like, go and do terrorism if you feel really strongly about it. Whereas going into the last election, a well-read and well talked about and much written about piece was called the Flight 93 election. It was written by a guy named Michael Anton, put out in a publication called American Greatness, wherein Michael Anton, using like a pseudonym that was Roman, like the way the founders did, proceeded to explain the 2016 election, the context of you're a passenger on Flight 93, and you've got two options right now, which is crash the plane or let Al Qaeda take it over. And the clear implication to the reader is we need to crash the plane. And Michael Anton, under whatever Decis Publius or whatever douchebag little Latin name he gave himself was, he argues we need to vote for Donald Trump. That's the equivalent of storming the cockpit, right? Taking our lives into our own fate, or our hands into our own fate. Another way of reading that essay and internalizing that essay is the Democrats are terrorists. And the only right thing to do when terrorists are trying to blow up this country or ruin this country that you love is to take the cockpit. And I like look back on 1-6 now, and I view it as the like storming of the cockpit. It was the Flight 93 moment where these people thought they were right and good and justified to go and storm the halls of Congress and chant "Hang Mike Pence," and it was right and good. But it makes so much sense. Unlike on the left, where like, yeah, okay, like look, if Portland or Chop or any of those places got like violent or whatever, you could like actually make a cultural link to like how that escalated, where it's like, well, it started here and then it moved here, moved here, moved here, moved here. Went too far. This is on their side. It is the air that they breathe now. Like ever since the Flight 93 election, became the dominant vein of thinking, this sort of stuff is just going to keep on happening.
Finbar, I'd actually really be interested to hear how this sort of stuff looks to you in Ireland.
Um, it's very hard to put it into words, really, because it is. We have some politicians who are a little bit out there, but you can actually see the path back to reality from them, and the ones that don't are really, in reality, are very much sidelined in that case. So when we look at that and we see this business whereby, what's the word for it? People see something small and then they take the absolute thing. It's like we had a case whereby I think there was an Irish person on holidays in Florida and his car broke down and he knocked on someone's door and they shot him through the door. Okay. And that would have that's news. It probably happens all the time, but obviously the person was allowed to do that because they were allowed to stand their ground. And the fact that the person just knocked on the door and was shot and killed, that's not something that we get here. So that's like the idea that you have something that you see as an issue, and then you just go for the absolute maximal position to clean. It's like using a hammer for everything, because you have a hammer, and so everything is seen as has to be, you have to. Everything is the end of society, so therefore you have to go and start chopping people's heads off and scooping out their brains. That's your solution for every problem.
And Trump's rhetoric in particular, it was always like we love them or they're dogs. You know what I mean? Like it's super binary. And so yeah, like it sort of leads to that. We are up against the clock. The name of the show is Don't Worry About the Government, which you can find at don'tworry.tv. You can support the show and watch the video version of the show at patreon.com/DWATG. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. Robert's got a moat around his house, so like don't even bother. Finbar, do you have anything you'd like to plug? Nope, he doesn't have anything to plug. So if you want to follow the show, it's at DWATG. Otherwise, I want to thank you guys so much for listening. Until the next one, bye-bye.
So we made it to page 10.